Um, we are continuing in 1 Corinthians 14, and we've been preaching 12 through 14. The last couple of weeks, Jack Moraine was here, and he talked about tongues. And then last week, Verla Marie and Angie talked about prophecy, and that's the first half of 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Now I'm digging into the second half of chapter 14, and that is focused on what does order in worship look like? What does orderly worship with all of the spiritual gifts look like? So let's read this together in 1 Corinthians 14, beginning in verse 26. What then shall I say, brothers and sisters? When you come together, each of you has a hymn, a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Everything must be done so that the church may be built up. If anyone speaks in a tongue, 2 or at the most 3 should speak, 1 at a time, and someone must interpret. If there's no interpreter, the speaker should keep quiet in the church and speak to himself and to God. 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. And if a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop. For you can all prophesy in turn, so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. The spirits of the prophets are subject to the control of the prophets. For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregations of the Lord's people. Star, asterisk, note, these next 2 verses I'm not going to cover today. I am going to spend all of next week on it, though. Ready? Women should remain silent in the churches. How do I silently say the rest of this? They are not allowed to speak, but should be in submission as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. Like I said, those last 2 verses deserve a whole week of their own, but it is a part of orderly worship. We're going to kick it to next week, okay? The irony is not lost on me. Okay. So we're talking about order in worship. And when you think about the Spirit and order, the first time Spirit and order come together is not 1 Corinthians 12, 13, 14. Anyone know where? Genesis 1:1, the very first verse of the Bible. So when we think about the Spirit of God coming, what happens when the Spirit of God comes? You know, being the age that I am and having grown up in the church, like my peak teen, young adult years were in the height of like revival era, right? Like the whole Toronto thing and the Spirit was falling, right? And so that like impressed on my mind this idea of like when the Spirit comes, it looks like chaos, right? But maybe it looks like that, but actually when the Spirit comes, it looks like Genesis 1:1. Let's start with Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So here in the NIV, it uses the words formless, empty, and darkness. Other translations call this chaos. The Spirit was hovering over the chaos, the formlessness, the emptiness, the void. And then it says, then God spoke, and he said, let there be light. So he begins to bring order out of this chaos. And then it goes on to describe the six following days of creation. There's the days of forming. Day 1 is day and night. Right? Yeah. 2 is sky and sea. 3 is dry land and vegetation. And then day 4 is God filling the things that he formed. So day 4, the sun, moon, and stars correlate to day and night. Day 5, birds and the sea creatures correlate to the sea and the sky. And day 6, the land animals and the humans correlate to the dry land and vegetation. And so this is very orderly, isn't it? So when the Spirit comes and he hovers over the chaos of our lives, of the church, of the world, he's forming things and he's filling things. That's what it means when the Spirit comes. Now, sometimes it looks like what we would call chaos, right? Like, I love myself a good Holy Spirit meeting, where you never know what's going to happen, right? But did you know that even in those moments, that's actually the Spirit hovering and bringing order to where there's chaos in our lives, chaos in our church, chaos in our society, and making first things first, wrong things right, dead things alive. This is what the Spirit does when he comes. And as this story in Genesis 1 continues to that humans part, it says, God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals and all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his image, in the image of God. He created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." In other words, that all of that activity of filling, the Spirit started, and we as humans have been given the commission to, with him, partner with him to continue. So the order making is initiated by the Spirit, empowered by the Spirit, but enacted by humans. So when the Spirit of God comes today, November 23rd, at Crestwood Vineyard, we expect the Holy Spirit to be making order out of chaos. And we expect that he will use humans to help do it, because this is the original design. So, what Paul so beautifully does here in 1 Corinthians 14, it gives some specific examples of what that might look like in a worship service. Before I get into that, the order part, I want to recap kind of the argument, because this is all one argument that Paul is making. Just, we've broken it down into 6 or 8 weeks or something. But this is all one thing that he's saying, right? There's one main point that he's trying to get to. So I want to kind of back up a little bit and recap what Paul has said thus far in chapters 12, 13, and 14. First of all, in chapter 12, he starts by saying there is one Spirit, the Holy Spirit, that distributes the gifts. And my beautiful daughter just a few minutes ago pointed out to me that I copied and pasted my notes to myself. So the manifestations of the Spirit include wow and walk, which would be Jeanine's shorthand for word of knowledge and word of wisdom. Okay, not wow and walk. Did you know walking is a gift of the Spirit? Okay, the manifestations of the Spirit are word of wisdom, word of knowledge, faith, healing, miracles, prophecy, discernment, tongues, and interpretation of tongues by the same Spirit. And then he also says, all of us need all of the gifts. Like the hand can't say to the foot that I don't need you. No person is unessential in this scenario, right? Or less essential. And then in chapter 13, he starts saying well, let's make sure we do this in love, right? He says spiritual gifts must operate in love, or they become like noise, like clanging cymbals. It's just noise to people's ears. If you're prophesying to me, but you don't love me, I'm not going to listen to a word you say, right? It's just noise to my ears. And he also makes the argument that one day spiritual gifts will cease in the fullness of when the kingdom comes. You don't need healing when the fullness of the kingdom comes. You don't need prophecy when Jesus is right here in our midst, right? So these are a temporary gifts of the Spirit to give us what we need in this in-between time that we find ourselves living in. And so then we get into chapter 14. He starts out by saying, eagerly desire spiritual gifts, all of them, but especially prophecy. Why? And then he gets into contrasting tongues and prophecy, and he talks about private tongues versus public tongues. Tongues are a message towards God. Prophecy is a message towards people. If you weren't here for Jack Morane's sermon on that a few weeks ago, it's excellent. You should watch it online. And then he talks about prophecy is actually better than tongues because it builds up the church and is intelligible. Intelligibility is, I can't even say, I just said intelligibility wrong. Intelligibility is important with spiritual gifts. And so in that way, prophecy can be better. And then also, he says, tongues in the public setting can be incredibly beneficial, but only if it's interpreted, because it makes no sense if I just blah, 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 blah to you, right? But if there's an interpretation, then that can be edifying and uplifting. So that's what's happened so far in these 3 chapters. And so then he switches a little bit in this chapter 14, verse 26. Now his goal in the rest of chapter 14 is to clarify what orderly worship looks like. It's his summary of okay, now that we've got all of this groundwork done, what does it mean to do this in an orderly way? Orderly worship includes 3 things that we're going to talk about that come from this passage. 1, everyone is expected to bring their gifts. You are important, and what the Spirit is doing and saying and through you and with you is important. So expect to give when you come to church. 2, exercise self-control and sound judgment with spiritual gifts. And 3, remember that the goal of spiritual gifts is to actually be a gift to people. And so we're going to go through each of these. Number 1, everyone is expected to bring their gifts. In verse 26, it says, when you come together, each of you has a hymn, a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or interpretation. So there's an expectation of non-spectatorship. There's an expectation of contributorship. When we come to church, there is an expectation on you to come with something, much like we came with food today. There is an expectation that when you come to church, you are prepared to pray for people. You are prepared to give a prophetic word. You're prepared to minister healing. The worship team practices and works really hard. They have prepared to bring their hymns, right? Those of us who preach, we work really hard. We prepare to bring a word of revelation, right? And so, but all of us, whether you have a formal role, you all hereby are commissioned with a formal role, bring your gifts. Everyone is expected, every time we gather, to bring what the Holy Spirit has given you, because the Holy Spirit has and is giving you his gifts, and the gifts aren't for you, the gifts are for us. So it says, when you come together, and so that the context of the Corinthian church that Paul was speaking to is they were gathering in house churches, in homes. And so it's a little bit different environment than in a large building like this with this configuration and the live stream and all that like that. We have a little bit of a different setup. There are house churches that meet now too, but it says when you gather together. So it's not just on a Sunday morning, but when you're grabbing coffee with each other, when you're gathering around a campfire at the layman's house, or when you're gathering for a Christmas party. There is an expectation that the Spirit can move at any moment, and we are expected to bring those gifts. So that the church is constantly building up the church. Like the church should be the most encouraging and built up place you go to all week long. Because there's an expectation by you and the person next to you and that person next to them that everyone is coming to build this thing up. Because that's what the Spirit's doing. Did you know that? We should have an expectation every time that we're gathering that the Spirit is building up the church. And then I do want to say, I think this is an area that we're really leaning into here as a church at Crestwood. I think we do a good job of encouraging everyone to pray, everyone to know how to pray for healing and know how to prophesy. That's exactly what Verla Marie and Angie spent all last Sunday talking about. But I also know that we haven't always done a great job as a church of like really giving people a place to exercise those gifts, and we're really trying to be more intentional going into 2026 in how we do that. And so there's a place for you here, and I want you to know that. We want more ways to grow in the gifts of the Spirit and more ways to use those. So the second thing that Paul is saying here in this passage is that we can actually exercise self-control and sound judgment with the operation of the Holy Spirit and the gifts, right? There tends to be a false notion, and in parts of the church, not all of the church, that like if I follow the Spirit, I have to check my brain at the door, right? Or if I'm going to be an intellectually sound critical thinker, that I'm therefore opposed to the move of the Spirit, right? Not true. The argument that Paul is making here is there's an intersection of the gifts of the Spirit with the fruit of the Spirit. We should want both. With the operation of the gifts of the Spirit, we can also operate self-control and patience, love. And you know what? We've all seen bad scenarios where the gifts of the Spirit are just plowing through without the fruit of the Spirit. How helpful was that? Did it build up the church long time, like long term, over time? Probably not. May have had some like moments of helpfulness, but what we're aiming for is the intersection of increased spiritual gifting and increased spiritual fruit. And if we can attain both of those and we value both of those, that's what the Spirit is after in our churches. And this means we get to make sure our egos get out of the way. It's not about us. And gee, look, aren't I great? Because I have my magical wand, Holy Spirit, whatever gift, you know? No, we actually get to practice some self-control. We practice some humility. We practice preferring others over ourselves. And some specific ways that Paul gives examples of this. In verse 27 and 28, he's talking about guidelines for tongues. He says 2 to 3 people at the most should give a word in tongues, and someone must interpret it. If no one interprets it, it means you were probably wrong. He says the speaker should keep quiet in the church and not speak to speak to himself and to God. Like, somewhere along the line, you may have thought this was about you. So let's take a seat. Let other people share the words, because apparently, if there's not an interpretation, that wasn't actually the Spirit speaking. Awkward moment, sit down. You need to just talk to God yourself, right? It's a little harsh, I got to say. It feels awkward. But honestly, I've been in settings where, and actually there's a lot of stories of like John Wimber back in the early Vineyard days, where he would just say, yeah, that word's not from God, sit down. I mean, to me, I'm like, I don't want to hurt people's feelings, you know? But like, do you know how safe that makes you feel in a room? If someone calls out some BS to say, nope, that wasn't Holy Spirit, sit down. Because we want the real thing, right? We want the real thing. And then in verse 29, he starts giving some guidelines for prophecy as well. Again, he says 2 to 3 at the most. And then the other should weigh carefully what is said. In other words, what is said could be wrong. Or it could be misapplied or misinterpreted, misunderstood. So if there is a prophecy, and Linda, do we have that slide about testing prophecy? Thank you. I forgot to say that earlier, but she's ahead of me. She's so smart. So if you do receive a word, you should test it. Does it align with who God is in the Bible, what he's already said? You write it down, you pray about it, you share it. But like, all prophecies should be tested, which means some will not pass the test. And that's okay. I would rather have an environment in which we have to say, no, that wasn't God, sit down, Or someone gives a word to someone else, like, nope, doesn't apply. And we can all gracefully still love each other and still come back next week and do it again. That sounds like a Holy Spirit kind of church. He continues to say, if a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop. In other words, don't be long-winded. Someone else, God may be speaking to someone else as well. And if someone else has a word, we can prefer each other and actually think like, oh, maybe the thing that's stirring in me is maybe just for me or maybe not for this moment. And I can take a seat back and prefer the other person because it's the same Holy Spirit that's working in the room. I don't have to worry that if I'm up here giving a word, that like Holy Spirit stops here with me and I've got everything. You know what I mean? We need each other. So then in his scenario, the example he's giving, like if someone else has a word, you can defer to that because it's the same Spirit. Same Holy Spirit moving. He also says, take turns. How convenient, right? Take turns so that everyone can be instructed and encouraged. I just have to imagine, like, what was happening in the Corinthian house churches that made him, like, spell all of these things out. It must have been pretty, they weren't taking turns. There was more than 3 people. They were grandstanding. It was a bit of a mess, which makes me think, like, if Paul had hope for that church, there's good things coming for Crestwood too. And then he says, the spirit of the prophets are subject to the control of the prophets. In other words, okay, prophet, you can shut your mouth. You can hold on to that word. You don't have to grandstand. You don't have to tell everybody how right you are. If it really is a prophetic word, it's within your control and you should control it. It should be shared in love and grace and sometimes brevity. Right? Brevity for the win. So in other words, when the Spirit comes, when the Spirit moves, it doesn't mean that you are without agency. In fact, a marker of maturity in gifts is that you practice self-control while operating in the spiritual gifts. And you can defer to each other. You can prefer each other over yourselves. And this is an important note to realize when the Holy Spirit comes and he hovers over the chaos and he brings order out of chaos, order doesn't necessarily have to mean restriction. Sometimes it does, but it shouldn't mean restriction. In fact, when order comes, life should happen. More beauty should happen. And you know, like a puzzle in a puzzle box, like when you buy it, it's in the box, and it's in order. It's in a box, right? But for God to make something out of that, you have to dump it. And there's pieces everywhere. Some of them are up, some of them are down. Chaos. So actually, sometimes the first step in the Holy Spirit's order making looks sloppier than it did before. Looks messier than it did before. When I do this too, but my husband does this in spectacular fashion. Sometimes I will come home and every drawer has been emptied. It's strewn across the bed, the floor. What are you doing? I'm organizing. Anyone ever done this? You dump everything out? What are you doing? I'm organizing. But it involves dumping everything out so you can pull the trash. You can pull out the things that you don't want or need anymore. They can be donated. And you can put things where they belong. So sometimes when the Holy Spirit comes and he's bringing order to your chaos, it can look a little messy. It can look like, God, are you sure? And may we be a grace-filled church that allows that to happen. May we be filled with grace when we see mess in our own lives and mess in other people's lives. because that doesn't necessarily mean the Holy Spirit isn't moving. Now, make sure you're following the Holy Spirit, right? Because sometimes our mess is just because we're messy, right? So don't have mess because you're messy. But Holy Spirit mess is all right. Expected, welcomed. Like one example of this is I received a prophetic word when I was about 20 years old, and God used that word for me to realize, and I had been oblivious to this prior to that moment, how emotionally capped off I was in my life. And I had lived in this little tiny box of emotions, but God had this whole thing that he had created me for in my emotions, but I'd never experienced that. So you know what the next weeks and months looked like? I was angry. I was depressed. I was sad. Now, on the outside, you might think, angry, depressed, sad, probably not what God's doing. It was exactly what God was doing. God was making things, opening things up, making things a little messy so that he could start rebuilding it, right? So when we say, and when Paul says we need order in worship, that doesn't mean we control it, we restrict it. It can be a little messy. Let's just make sure it's God, okay? And the third thing that Paul's doing here is reminding us that the goal of the gifts is to be a gift. 14:26, he says, everything must be done so that the church may be built up. In other words, sharing a prophetic word that ain't encouraging, sharing a tongue that is not glorifying to God, it's just noise, right? It should actually be a gift to the church, to a person, to the church as a whole. It should actually be a gift. And I once had a counselor say to me, it seems obvious, but sometimes it's the most obvious things that you need reminding of. The goal of communication is to communicate. And sometimes we're trying to communicate and we're just talking over each other, right? And is any communication actually happening? No, noise is happening, right? Same principle applies here. The goal of the gifts is to be a gift. I know when I was starting in spiritual gifts, when I was first beginning to understand what it looked like to see something from the Lord and then to share what I was seeing, I had this guy in college, and we were on the worship team together, and I would just get really frustrated with him. And I thought I had a picture from the Lord about this whole diamond in the rough thing with the dirt all around it. And so my very immature way of sharing that word to him was God's got some stuff good in you, but you've got all this junk around you, and you just need to straighten your life up, And I'm pretty sure that's not what God was saying in that moment. So we need to operate in love. We need to operate in patience, in perseverance, in believing the best, not only about the person, but that what God is doing in that person is beautiful. And if I'm operating the spiritual gifts, then it's going to facilitate that in some way, not bring condemnation or. So yeah, let's do this with kindness and love, not like I did the first time. So kind of bouncing through some of these points that Paul has made through these chapters, how do we know that a gift is actually a gift? Have you ever been around the person that was prophesying and you're you're not prophesying? How do we know that a spiritual gift is actually a gift? Number one, back in chapter 12, it exalts Christ. Is Jesus being glorified in this situation? If not, drop it. Just ignore it, right? 2, spiritual gifts are given by the Spirit. They're not conjured from myself. If from somewhere inside me I have this gift to the world. No, it's the Holy Spirit that gives these gifts. It's loving. it's understandable, it's intelligible, like it makes sense. Like we can drop our Christianese at the door and just talk normal, right? And it builds up the church. Verse 26 says, everything must be done so that the church may be built up. Is it actually building up the church? And then the last thing, which will get pushed to next week, what else is a spiritual, how do we know it's a spiritual gift? That's if certain people don't ever talk. We'll get to it next week, right? Okay. He ends this in verse 33 by saying, God is not a God of disorder, but a God of peace. And that's the God that we serve. That's the Holy Spirit that's here. That's the Holy Spirit that's here today. I do know that we have lunch waiting for us, but I do want to give us just a moment to wait on the Holy Spirit. Can we stand, please? And what I'd like to do is just take a minute in quietness, as quiet as the little folks in the back can be, and that's okay if they're not. But as big folks, we can operate in some self-control, right? And we're just going to wait in quietness on the Holy Spirit to come. And I want to just, after that moment of silence, just maybe pray a few things over us. And if there are some people who feel like you have a wow or a walk or a prophetic word, we'll give a minute for that, okay? Holy Spirit, would you come? Lord, you're already here, but Lord, would you come? Lord, we thank you.